Okay, well, a very, very warm welcome virtually to Newnham College, to members of the Women of the Year, associates, Newnham Associates, members of the female lead and other Newnham College members. Newnham College, Newnham Associates and the Women of the Year have come together for a summer event for the last 5 years, and I think it's become a bit of an annual tradition for obvious reasons, not in real life for a while, but we didn't want to forego another year. So I'm really delighted that we're able to hold this virtually today. And it's a huge pleasure to have Women of the Year Award Chair and Newnham alumna Julie Etchingham chair this event. Thank you very much indeed, as well as former Newnham Fellow Senior Tutor Terri Apter, who is our lead speaker. So I'm really looking forward to this afternoon. I hope you are too. We're recording, so we know from past experience of events that we get multiples of people watching later. So that's a very exciting function that the virtual world gives us. So I'm going to hand over to Julie, who's going to introduce the theme of the event, our speaker and panelists. And then I'll pop back at the end and say a few words. So please sit back, or don't just sit back, because I think we want some questions and answers from you. So certainly please enjoy. Julie, over to you.
Alison, thank you very much indeed. And thank you especially once again to the Newnham Associates on behalf of Women of the Year for hosting us again this year, albeit online, of course. As you can see, we've got our backgrounds that have been provided by Newnham, so we can just have a little fantasy moment and imagine that we're in the beautiful gardens and surroundings of Newnham, and hope very much that this time next year we will be back with you. As Alison said, this is the 5th time our institutions have come together after the original kind invitation by the Associates, and as a Newnhamite, it makes me really happy that we have this connection between so many remarkable women from all walks of life. And I know that people are joining us from around the world today, which is very special. And from all of us at Women of the Year, we'd like to congratulate Newnham on its 150th anniversary. We're in our 68th year, so we've got a bit to go to catch you up. So welcome wherever you are in the world, joining us online. And as Alison mentioned, we are recording the event and we'll share a private link to it afterwards. So as you know, the title of our talk and discussion today is the She-cession, which you need to get your teeth in for. The She-cession, why we need women at the helm of a post-pandemic recovery. A subject which, as we wait with bated breath for that moment of lift from lockdown, and we may have to wait a little more yet, I believe, it couldn't be more timely. There is little doubt, whether you look at the statistics or quite a lot of our own lives and the lives of women that we know, that much of the burden of the pandemic has fallen on female shoulders. The infamous government advert, you might remember, it only briefly saw the light of day, "Stay home, stay lives," depicted women homeschooling children, doing the housework, with only a man relaxing on the sofa. Now, it rightly prompted outrage, of course, didn't last for very long, but for very many women, it would have rung true. It is worth saying, of course, that more men have died of COVID. But according to the Fawcett Society, in almost every other type of impact, whether at home, at work, in finances and in mental health, women have largely borne the brunt. Women are more likely to work in frontline public services. They're the biggest proportion of single parents. Globally too, there are big alarm bells being rung about a huge backslide in the education of girls. And of course, we know that women of different ethnicities have been affected in different ways too. But, and it's a big but, are there opportunities to be seized in this moment? Has the pandemic, as some have described it, really been a disaster for feminism? Flexible working has suddenly become the new norm. There's been a boom in female entrepreneurship, and there is a new recognition for those who work in caring professions. So today we've brought together a brilliant panel who can help us examine these questions and hold them up to the light from so many different angles, and I'll introduce all of them shortly. But first, our main speaker today is going to help us to seize the moment. Dr. Terri Apter is a leading psychologist, writer, and former fellow of Newnham, as Alison was saying. When the pandemic hit, she was already engaged in some research along with the Female Lead organisation looking at the rapidly changing world of work for women. So I'm delighted to introduce Terri to you now. I know that you're all clapping and cheering wildly at your desks. Terri, it's over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Alison. I'm delighted to be here today with this wonderful group of women to talk about the recent Female Lead report and to hear your perspective on the challenges to equality and the paths to progress. Now, the report I wrote for the Female Lead highlights the term unentitled mindset, the feeling that you're not worth more or even as much as you're being given, even though on some level objectively you know you are. And the key to change is not yet again asking women to go to work on themselves so that they can change. Progress involves addressing work environments that activate unentitled mindset, and lessons from the game-changing practices forced by the pandemic can guide us here. These suggest how the current template of valuable worker, valuable employee, valuable colleague can be transformed to close the entitlement gap, because this gap is closely linked to the gap in men and women's career trajectories. So the Female Leads Women at Work project arose from a puzzle. Why, in spite of so many positive changes in recent decades, is there still a distinctive his and hers career trajectory? So while women and men now start at roughly the same salaries for similar jobs, and this is great progress, at mid-stage career, from late 20s to early 40s, career trajectories diverge. Men's continues to rise and women's flattens. And current research on women's careers tends to focus on entry level, where a lot of women remain on a sticky floor of jobs with very limited opportunities, or on high profile senior positions where we applaud women, of course, gaining positions such as CEO. And these are very important, but also important, and yet often ignored, is mid-stage career, because this phase involves special challenges for women. This is when questions about balance, priorities, and fertility start to bite. This is when work and personal dilemmas necessitate what Mary Catherine Bateson called composing a life, drawing together meaningful themes to shape an individual life pattern within a context of shifting opportunities and, of course, constraints. Women have to be imaginative composers of their own lives because ready-made patterns don't fit. So 70 women, all at mid-stage career, all working in the UK, participated in our study. They were from diverse social, ethnic, and religious backgrounds, but they had diverse incomes, from below £25,000 a year to way above £150,000 a year. But all had made a good start in their careers. Now, given this is our sample, it's clear that our findings don't cover all women, don't speak for all women. There are women who never get an opportunity to make a good start in a career. There are women who are denied education and control over their fertility. There are women who face abuse and very stringent social control. But I believe that the concept unentitled mindset can be used to frame problems of inequality across a range of contexts. And I'm looking forward to thoughts from the panel as to how this might be extended or adjusted to have wider use. But before I outline what the sticking points at mid-stage career are, I want to address various myths about them. So the first myth is that women are uncomfortable admitting and embracing ambition. So therefore, they don't keep their foot on the accelerator and they don't move forward. Yet the women participating in our research describe themselves, freely and proudly as ambitious. We didn't feed them this term. We asked them to describe themselves. And over again, they would say, I'm ambitious and I'm proud of it. I can't remember a time when I wasn't ambitious. There was no ambivalence about this whatsoever. A second myth is that women are less likely to identify with their careers than men, that motherhood will trump all aspects of their identity. So they'll, of course, make decisions that lower their career prospects. But again, all of our participants, whether or not they were mothers, cited how important it was to their identity to have a high impact, challenging career, that this was fundamental to their sense of self. A third myth is that women are risk averse when it comes to professional challenges. So, they won't take the risks that are necessary for those more demanding roles. Yet among our women, high up on their list of values was being challenged. They also wanted to contribute to their workplace. They wanted respect in their workplace, and they took risks to secure these. They were willing to leave a job, even if it was a secure, well-paid job, in order to get a better work environment. They were willing to leave a job and start their own company, not knowing what the outcome was going to be, in order to create the working conditions and terms that suited them. Now, another myth is that women are held back by imposter syndrome. And this is the belief that they're not as competent as they appear, or that they fear they're not as worthy as other people think they are. And that this fear of exposure prevents them from taking on more challenges. Now, this is one of the trickier myths to address because it is partly true. So 26% of our participating women reported that they did experience imposter syndrome. Where this becomes a myth is that it didn't hold them back. It became an incentive to grow their skills. And the other day I read a profile of Brenda Hale. This isn't yet published, but it will be soon, in which she says, I defy anybody not to have had imposter syndrome and be good at what they do. So in other words, imposter syndrome isn't a barrier to success. It's a necessary condition of achievement. So these are some of the myths. What is it that slows women's career trajectory at mid-stage? Well, in many work environments, many of the negative biases against women are defunct, or at least they're sufficiently localized and sporadic so that when they appear, they can be called out and challenged. I think we waste a lot of time if we worry about every single bias, because women today are pretty good at managing and resisting so many of them. But a few biases remain deeply embedded and deeply damaging in many workplaces. And the first persistent problematic bias is expectation bias. Now, expectation bias involves lower expectations of someone's contributions and potential, not on evidence of that individual, but on the basis of how that person is typecast. This is no longer likely to arise just because someone is female. Once upon a time it did, no longer. But it is very likely to arise from a distinctive female experience, and that is maternity. So many women told us that on informing their employer that they were taking maternity leave, they found that their access to clients, accounts, and responsibilities was suddenly restricted. They were no longer in line for promotions or pay increases. And sometimes this bias came in the form of protectiveness, as an employer said, oh, we don't want to burden you with more responsibilities at this time. But this was in sharp contrast to men who on becoming fathers were seen as likely to be more committed and were pushed forward in the queue for promotion. Now, what was interesting also was that expectation bias didn't only affect women who were directly, personally affected by it. We know that smart women are careful observers of other women. And because they witnessed how others were treated, they thought long and hard about the effect of having a child, what this would mean to their career. And many delayed it, waiting for some special point at which they would have enough clout to withstand expectation bias. And of course, as a result, some had fertility issues from this delay. Women who had older children learned that they were better off acting as though they didn't really have children, or certainly they didn't have childcare responsibilities. They were better off acting like men who had someone else carrying the mental and practical loads of parenting. Now, the second sticking point is the flexibility penalty. So women who worked flexibly or remotely or who took a career break were hit by a very long-term penalty. It wasn't just the time of their break, it had a long tail. And it could take up to 6 years to return to the level that they had been at before their career break. And it was only in firms where flexibility was the norm and where very senior men also worked flexibly, or in firms run predominantly by women, that there was no flexibility penalty. And now we come to the third bias, the one I call unentitled mindset. And this isn't a personal character trait. This isn't a permanent state of mind. Unentitled mindset arises in specific, identifiable environments. It arises when women consider asking for better pay or promotion, and they know they deserve it. But here they experienced very uncharacteristic anxiety and uncertainty. Their requests were often delayed by endless rumination around, is my case watertight? Is this the right time? Do I deserve this? And also, will I be punished in some way for asking? Will I be seen as grabby or ungrateful? An unentitled mindset is in some ways the most disturbing because it seems to be generated by women themselves, that it's a self-inflicted wound. But is this the best way to look at it? My answer is no, because unentitled mindset arises from what women learn about an organization's values. So when an organization sees a woman as less committed and ultimately less capable because she goes on maternity leave or works remotely or flexibly, they reveal a rigid template of the valuable worker as someone who can give everything to an employer, presumably because someone else, such as a wife, is carrying the mental loads and undertaking those intrusive practical tasks of domestic organization. Knowing this, knowing that she doesn't fit the rigid template of valued employee, any case she makes for increased pay or promotion, however strong in itself, has a weak foundation. Instead, she believes she's lucky to have her job, lucky for the pay and the conditions she already has. Now, another thing contributing to unentitled mindset is the mystique that so often surround pay and promotion negotiations. This mystique and the accompanying anxiety of feeling you don't know the rules of the game activate normally defunct stereotypes. So stereotypes about men being go-getting negotiations, while women really don't know how to negotiate. Or norms about what women are entitled to ask, suggesting that women who ask for more are grabby, greedy, or too big for her boots. So people who know they don't fit the template of standard, valuable worker and are in a situation governed by mysterious rules are much more likely to see themselves through the eyes of bias. So whether it's because they're a woman or because of ethnicity or religion or sexual orientation, it's in these conditions that the volume of those old whispers, who does she think she is, can get very loud. And work environments can be changed so they no longer activate the unentitled mindset. And a first step is reassessing standard measurement of valuable worker. Presenteeism, for example, is not a measurement of value in itself, but has become a proxy for value, a proxy that before the pandemic often went unchallenged. But the widespread practice of remote working during the pandemic does challenge the notion that remote or flexible working mean lower efficiency and commitment, that it's a soft option, a woman's thing. And there has been much discussion about how bad pandemic working conditions are for women and how this risks putting the clock back 50 years. But it also opens the possibility of a paradigm shift that will help make things fairer for women in the future. Remember, before the lockdown, only 5% of employees worked from home regularly, and the vast majority of those were women. And our participants told us that before the pandemic, they had been advised that asking for flexible working conditions would be career suicide. And this was why they welcomed pandemic lockdown and remote working. One woman said, with COVID, organizations have really gone through the eureka moment. Oh, we can actually trust people to be at home all day and work. Their productivity is pretty darn good. So indeed, now about 30% of employers are looking at remote working in a more positive light. And of course, the second step is to clarify and normalize pay and promotion discussions for all workers. When women are clear how to ask for better conditions for themselves, and when expectation bias and the flexibility penalty don't erode their entitlement, then their normal courage and confidence return, and they are as good at negotiating on their own behalf as they are for their team. And this is not a guess, it's not a hope, it's based on actual research. It's been tested and it's been shown to be effective. So remote working or flexible working aren't solutions in themselves, but what matters is that seeing that these are consistent with employees having value and continuing to grow their skills, the old rigid template of valuable worker can be challenged. Now, to take this forward, firms need actively to promote new models of valued employee and also offer support to enable different working patterns. They could push this through and even help change gender inequality in the home by showing that they expect men to take paternity leave and that all workers should demonstrate that they have a range of personal responsibilities outside the workplace. I mean, without proactive work on this, there is the risk of an in crowd that adheres to the old model of valuable worker, while those following more innovative models will become a second-class out crowd. We want to avoid that. So setting the agenda of being more imaginative in job design and more intelligent in assessing employee value is only one step in a long game of shifting the paradigm and eliminating unentitled mindset. Every agenda, no matter how much agreement there is, has to be implemented. And that will require input from women on the ground floor and in the boardroom, because women have far more experience in imaginatively designing individual careers and, of course, in composing their individual lives.
Terri, thank you very much indeed for that. I'm just being asked to start. We have an amazing Newnhamite, Charlotte Price, helping us with all the tech behind the scenes. So she's just asked me to switch my video back on with a very helpful little prompt. Terri, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. It's given us such a great leaping off point. And I love this idea of women at the midpoint in their lives. And that's not all the women that are here today by any means, but being sort of having to compose their lives imaginatively and what that might mean at this moment, just as we contemplate some of us going back into the office for the first time, some of us who have adapted to working half in, half out, and actually all the while watching quite carefully perhaps what our male colleagues are doing as well and what their preferences are. I think it's certainly in my workplace brought up a lot of really interesting questions. So there's so much to unpack from that really very thought-provoking talk. Thank you. And I know you're going to stay with us for the panel discussion. So I'm very happy now to introduce you to our amazing panel today, who are going to be able to take us through so many of the different areas that Terri brought up in her talk there. Qudsiya Batul is Head of Equalities and Strategy for the TUC. Maria Misra is Professor of Global History at Oxford University and Fellow of Keble College. We've allowed an Oxford backdrop into shot, just so we know we embrace all the Oxford people here too. Dr. Victoria Kimonides, who's actually in Athens. How glamorous is that? She's the Enterprise Co-Sale Director, One Commercial Partner for Microsoft. Hi, Victoria. And last but definitely not least, Jolie To, who's an award-winning young entrepreneur who set up the Pioneer programme to encourage young women into careers in maths. And she's only just finished her A-levels. So how amazing is that? That she's actually given some of her much longed for free time to join us this afternoon. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Just before we get talking, we'd love to get your questions, please, and we will come to them as part of our conversation, but also make sure we come to them in a block once we've concluded the first part of our discussion. So please pop your questions in the Q&A box. Anna Boheim's already put one in there, so I'll come to that shortly. But first of all, I just thought I'd come to each panelist and just give us a snapshot of your life in lockdown. I'd love to know what lessons you've learned in the pandemic, both personally and professionally, and how it's impacted the way you work. Qudsiya, perhaps I could come to you first.
Thanks, Julie. Lockdown has been, as I'm sure it has for many, many people, the single most transformative experience of my adult working life, if not life more broadly. And I've learned so many lessons about value, about worth, about time, about perspective. And I suppose I'll be quick, but personally, it was about stopping. So when Terri was talking, I felt very seen and very uncomfortably under the microscope at various points of what Terri was saying, as I'm sure many working women are. But I was, my career came first, my son came second, had a whistle-stop maternity leave, straight into childcare, back on the career train, because if you get off for too long, it leaves you behind and then there's no catching up. And then I was faced with a pause to everything, and faced with this 6-year-old child who I knew in passing, who knew me in passing. And, you know, we were forced to reacquaint with each other. And I talk about the things that he does and the person that he is, as though I'm on maternity leave for the first time. And people must think, your son's 6, why are you talking like he's 1? Because it's really exciting. And it made me realize how much working parents sacrifice when they feel they're not sacrificing anything at all. And this ideal that you can have it all doesn't actually exist unless we set the climate for it to exist, unless we address those barriers. And I will say one thing that I think is really important to highlight is, I mean, there's several, but another personal thing that's really important for me to highlight is the impact of homeschooling and the ask that was made on working mums to deliver homeschooling to the level that they were expected to deliver it, not once but twice, was absolutely astounding. I'm a trained teacher. I taught for 20 years. I was a head teacher for 5 years, and let me tell you, homeschooling was the one thing that nearly broke me, because it was so relentless. And as a working parent, the idea was to homeschool around your work. So it wasn't either or, it wasn't making space, it was just piling and piling and piling. And I think the recognition and the acknowledgement of the work that women do that is unpaid is really important. Of the role that women have in the home is really important. And the fact that, you know, we have to call on government and we have to call on employers to set the conditions for that to balance, and not to constantly go back to women to make one sort of sacrifice or another. Professionally, obviously, all those things then move over into my professional life. I'm a proud advocate for the trade union movement. Women's equality is absolutely at the forefront of my agenda at all times. And I think the pandemic has shone a light on the structural inequality that exists, and the way that women have borne the brunt of the pandemic in absolutely every single area. If nothing else has shown us, we can't go back. We have to put the marker down, and we have to move forward from this. We have to move forward in the types of work that women do, in how they're recognized, in really differentiating between low pay and low skill and low worth, and really setting the conditions for women to thrive and for working parents to thrive. You've got a great panel. I could talk about this forever. So I'm going to wrap it up.
Well, that's, I mean, you just laid out a whole load of things for us to get stuck into, Consia. Thank you. And Maria, I'm going to come to you next, because I know that, you know, from your very detailed work that you've done, global history vis-a-vis sexism and gender is part of the perspective you want to bring to this. But just give us your snapshot of working life, personal and professional impact and lockdown.
Well, I think I've been very lucky. I mean, I'm an academic, and I've been able to work from home, and it hasn't been a hugely different experience, except for, you know, having lectures and seminars and so forth online. And I suppose my impression being, I think, in a faculty which is currently being led by a man. Actually, we have a head of faculty who's a man. I mean, what's impressed me is that it's been a pretty kind of welfare-centric approach that the faculty's taken. And there's been a lot of concern, really, that burdens are spread evenly. And so I don't have children, for example, but obviously a lot of my colleagues do. And, you know, the faculty organised a kind of pooling thing so that people who were having to homeschool their children, which include male faculty members as well as female faculty members, could jump in and do teaching that you know, that they were going to find difficult. And I think that was pretty front and center of the way that the faculty thought about this. So I suppose what I found quite interesting is that clearly there's been a big stress on welfare here, as well as delivering academic, you know, the academic side of things. Obviously, I suspect women probably do more of it than men, because I think it is still tagged as an emotion, you know, emotional labor is something that women do. However, I suppose because I'm interested in sexism, I'm also interested in changes in masculinity. And so I'm quite interested in the degree to which I think quite a lot of men have picked up, you know, they've taken a fairly touchy-feely approach to all of this. Now, as I say, that may be because I'm very lucky, and I'm in an environment in which I think gender issues and gender equality is absolutely prioritized. But yes, I would say that everybody's thought a lot more about welfare. We've thought a lot more about welfare of our students. We've seen our students a lot more from a pastoral point of view, but we've also been encouraged to think about welfare of our colleagues. And I think genuine policies have been put in place to try and ensure, as far as we can, that people haven't been disadvantaged, particularly by you know, the burden of homeschooling.
Fascinating. I'm really interested in looking at that aspect, and I quite like Terri's reflection on that too at some point about, you know, how this has actually reshaped a lot of roles for men as well, that actually that burden of having to share out tasks, and even that sort of hunter-gatherer notion of being sent to the supermarket, I think some of that's shifted as well from the conversations I know I've certainly had with friends and colleagues at work. So that's a really really interesting insight, and great to hear that the faculty has put that welfare front and centre. Thank you very much for that, Ms. And given that you meant, Maria, given that you just mentioned about how you try to balance things out for the students as well, I think Jolie's probably our next young woman we want to hear from. Jolie, you've been in lockdown, you've done your A-levels in lockdown, but you set up this incredible programme that you've won an award for getting girls into maths and thinking about maths careers. Tell us about your lockdown and what you've learned.
Yeah, so it was very shocking, I'd have to say, to suddenly be thrown into lockdown in the middle of our lessons, because I still remember that I had one piece of work that I submitted, and then the next day we were suddenly having online lessons and I didn't see that piece of work again. So yeah, it was definitely a very new experience, but out of that I think comes a lot of opportunity. So it definitely made me think about how I could be more than just an A-level student, because to me it's so much more important than just your academics to have something along the side or some interest that you'd want to pursue further. So for me, that definitely enabled me to have that time to reach out and to actually connect with a lot of open-minded individuals as well, because I know that a lot of people on LinkedIn, for example, had a lot more time during their free day, and they'd email me, they'd volunteer to help out with an event. So that definitely helped me to develop professionally. But also the time that I had, the extra time that I have, you know, I didn't have to travel to school. It definitely gave me enough time to self-reflect and become a lot more introspective. So I know I learned a lot about myself, as I'm sure a lot of people here have as well. I know that I worked on my weaknesses. I had to think about how I could not only develop personally, but use that to help other people around me, provide these opportunities through webinars that I knew girls were missing at a time with schools shut. And I know I was very lucky as well to have guided home learning at my school. It was very structured, but I know that a lot of schools weren't as lucky and had to, you know, work entirely independently. But on the plus side, I'd say that that definitely helped us in terms of throwing us into independence. We had to take learning into our own hands. And that's really useful for university, I'd say. So I definitely learned more about my own learning style. Instead of having teachers, for example, teaching me the content or like showing me how things are done, I could kind of explore myself. So how did I learn best? So that was very useful. And lastly, I'd say the lockdown has probably taught me the quality of relationships over quantity. So in a time where everything's online, it's really hard to balance your studies and to maintain your friendships and relationships. But through Pioneer, I saw that having a few loyal members who really believed in what you were doing was way more impactful than having tons of people who maybe knew your name or knew roughly what you were doing, but weren't really genuinely into this field. And I think that's how I grew my impact, was having those original people who supported me and going through all the way with it. So yeah, that was really amazing to see.
Oh, that's amazing. It's great. I mean, it's one of the things I was hoping come out of this conversation is that we do know what women have been up against very largely during this pandemic, but there are positives there, aren't there? Though you can already sort of feel the ground shifting a bit, and it's what we do with it now at this sort of crucial moment that really counts. Thank you for that, Jolie. Fascinating. Just incredible that you're just doing all this alongside your A-levels. I mean, I really don't know where to start. But anyway, Victoria, I mean, I could see you smiling away listening to Jolie there. It's pretty inspirational stuff. What's it been like at Microsoft, and how have you navigated it?
I felt guilty at the beginning, to say the least, you know, because the past year has been interesting, to say the least. Carefully choosing that word, because the challenges we all know. And those that know me and know me well, they know that I'm an eternal optimist. So I just look at the positives. And 3 things I learned: value personal time. That's why I was smiling earlier from what I was hearing. To do what matters, and that work has become more human. For us at Microsoft, we have been working flexibly, remotely for many years. I would say almost 10 years back. So it hasn't been really that much of a novelty. We have been doing the same work, especially people like me that work in multiple geographies. It's all remotely. The least that I have done was not to travel every week. And that's why I said the word guilty. Because at the beginning, even as months were going past in the lockdown, I felt that I spend more time with my husband, more time with the family, And I really got to spend more time on my own, to think, to reflect. I think everyone had time to reflect. And one thing has been for sure, out of all of our leaders, is that we will never go back. We will never go back to the style that we had last year or the past 15 years. I've never stayed put for 10 days. In the past, I would say 15 years, 16 years. And now I'm in the same location for more than a year. Did that have impact in the way that I work? Yes, as I mentioned earlier, work has become more human because we are, yes, two-dimensional, not three-dimensional, but it's up close and personal. We do talk to one person. Even when we have social events online, we do spend more time closer to someone, even having a drink, as opposed to being in the bar and having the music and be a little bit out. So I think there are a number of little things that have turned into the digital etiquette that we did not have before. So that is something that has been a change. Now, the other thing is that it is an opportunity. It is an opportunity to develop stronger self-awareness, and that helps addressing the entitlement gap. It is important because we can be more confident on how we prioritize. We know why we prioritize, and we know that that roots back to the values that we have. And it also, I feel at least more entitled to the decisions that I make, my wants and needs. So the pandemic troika, as I call it, the no touch, the mask, the distance, made me wonder whether this is really, in fact, a challenge turned into an opportunity for women, an opportunity to do our own soul searching, to be able to get to know ourselves better, and at the end of the day, come to terms with our own wants and needs. So there is no have to. It's only what I need and what I want to do. And I think that's the essence of what has come out of this.
That's great, Victoria. Thank you very much indeed. And that whole phrase, "we will never go back," I think sort of hangs in the air after that insight there. I wonder, I think so many of us have had a reassessment personally and professionally on that basis. But I suppose it's also, in very many people's eyes, it would be seen as a luxury to be able to say that too. And I suppose that's where I wanted to pick up, Kudsi, to come back to you, is that a lot of the observations that we're all making between us, and Terri alluded to this too, it is a privileged position to be able to say, never go back. There are a lot of women in this pandemic, and you will be supporting them through the work that you do at the TUC, who have, things haven't changed. They've just got demonstrably harder. We know that women make up overwhelmingly the largest proportion of the public sector workforce. From some of the lessons that professional women who have the luxury of being able to work flexibly have learned, how do we shift things for the women that you represent? And I'm thinking about women in low pay sectors, women from diverse backgrounds. What do you think the most urgent questions are there?
I'm really glad you highlighted that, Julie, and I think that's a really important point, because this country has continued on the back of those women, and I think that's a really important point to make. The key workers, the teachers in the schools, because schools didn't close, let's not forget that. Schools closed to children that weren't children of key workers. They remained open, and learning went online, and predominantly those roles were filled by women. And I think the other thing we've got to really highlight is that home working is not a synonym for flexible working. Flexible working is much more broader and should be applied to far more context. Home working has got the, it is a luxury for many people. And I think we need to look at ways to be far more flexible for those that don't traditionally fall into those roles. But the answer is, I think we need to address really fundamental things like paid childcare. We need to look at better paid childcare in this country for women that are in those jobs where they don't have access to those systems, where flexible working is limited, where part-time working is limited. We need to look at better childcare options and more childcare options. We don't have a really extensive birth to 5 program out there, and it's very limited, and there's a massive reliance on family childcare. We need to look at a real living wage for people. You know, it's no secret that people in this country aren't operating on a real living wage. And where are those people? They're on the front line. They're in the key sectors. They are doing delivery jobs. They are doing service jobs. They are doing hospital jobs. And we must bring that up. And one of the other areas, there's 2 other areas that I think are really important. One is around pay gap monitoring. We need to really get an idea of what women are paid in this country for the work that they do and how it's different to men, and then put a series of actions in place about how we bridge that gap.
And it's worth, sorry to interrupt your flow there, but it's worth pointing out, as Terry and I were discussing a bit earlier, the gender pay gap monitoring was suspended, wasn't it, in lockdown? I mean, this is one of those key little indicating factors of where we need to presumably address, we need to get back on board as fast as humanly possible.
Yeah, I mean, puts me in a rage. But you know, it went from mandatory to voluntary, and what happens when things go from mandatory to voluntary? The rate goes right down. So the reality is we don't know what happened to women's pay during this time, besides what women have told us. And what women have told us is it's been dire. We know what's happened with job loss. We know what's happened with furlough. We know what's happened with women having to use annual leave and all the rights that they haven't been entitled to. And I think it's important to recognise all those things are tied to pay. And one of the ways that I think, again, we need to go back to equalising is we need to get employers and the government to really tie down equality impact assessments. If you are going to bring policies in, we need to see how they affect different groups of people differently. We need to see how your policies affect women. And we need somebody outside of the government, like the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, monitoring that. And so that we have got an objective system that really tells us about the experience of working women.
Yeah, and I'd quite like to leap off from that and come to you, Maria, if I may, because I know that you're really interested in talking too about female leadership as we emerge from the pandemic, because we've had some sort of really big political moments for women during the time that we've experienced lockdown, and not least the fallout after Sarah Everard. Before Sarah Everard, we had the Me Too movement, which had, you know, was a similar moment that sort of flashed through social media. You know, do you feel, Maria, that this is a sort of moment for women's politicization? We've had, you know, precious few women leading us through this politically. What's your sense of that?
Yes, I think that the you know, it's been interesting, the handling of the pandemic. I mean, I think the framing of it in the media has focused on women's leadership, probably in a rather sexist way, which I think is dangerous. I mean, I think there is a problem when events like this happen, which are clearly to do with what people see as domestic welfare, health issues. That women's leadership is seen as particularly relevant. Now, I think that the evidence suggests that there's very little real difference between the way women and men have handled it if they're in political leadership positions. Obviously, there aren't very many women, so it's a very, very small group. I think the only thing that I did see that was quite interesting was where women were, where there were more women in legislatures, schools were slower to close, and that is quite interesting. So I think on the one hand, we've got a danger of a media framing elephant trap. Women do welfare, but then when we've got to focus on the economy, then we need the real guys back. You know, and there is evidence that this happens. So, I mean, in Argentina, women were dropped from party electoral tickets once electorates considered that the economy was the main issue. If electorates think that welfare is the main issue, then parties will recruit women onto tickets. And of course, we all know about the danger of the glass cliff leadership problem, you know, which is that women are often recruited to lead when companies are going belly up, or when countries are going belly up. So I'm quite cautious of saying that, you know, because this is a pandemic, this is a big opportunity for women. I think we don't want to get dragged into that kind of men and women lead differently. Or if we are going to be, then I think we need to be quite nuanced about it. I think on the issue of activism, that's very interesting. There's definitely been a lot of mobilization of women, both in the global south, in America. I mean, more women have actually stood for election in America. More Black women stood for election as mayors in America. And of course, we saw major mobilizations in places like Poland and Hungary, although sadly, of course, they didn't work. Mobilization and activism is great. And obviously, the more that carries on, the more that people like us help, the more networked it becomes, the better. But I mean, women in other countries, and us, of course, to some extent, are up against a big populist movement, which will use gender-phobic rhetoric to mobilize votes. You know, certain politicians around the world, mentioning no names, know that there are votes to be had in attacking what we would see as gender-friendly policies. And I think that ultimately we can't assume that things will be better for women. I think it depends very much on what narrative emerges from this.
Perhaps Jolie, I could bring you in on that as well, because you know you're absolutely, you know, in that central, you know, there's so many young women of your age were galvanized by that moment in lockdown, weren't they? Do you feel that amongst your friends, amongst your cohort at school, that there is a sense of women being politicized, not just by the impact of the pandemic, but some of the things that have emerged whilst we've been in lockdown, where I suppose people have had more time to think about it, they've had more energy to be on social media and joining in those campaigns? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I would definitely say that I've seen an increase in even in my year group, just in collective activism, taking control and leadership of our own opinions. So for example, I know that after the BLM movement, a group of students in our year actually set up a podcast to discuss these issues. And we had weekly discussions as well with our head of sixth form about these topics. And especially with the Sarah Everard incident as well, because it happened so close to where my school is. It was very pertinent. And I know that we are, as a year group ourselves, without the teachers even influencing us, we organized the day to wear red to honor her and to kind of bring awareness to women's rights. So I've definitely seen an increase in amongst my own year group, but I think on a wider scale, even with the pandemic, I think a lot of our generation has been felt that we've been kind of unfairly treated in a way, because a lot of our childhood experience has been taken away. We can't even go out without having to think about whether we have our mask, hand sanitizer, are we following all the rules? And I think a lot of students also stopped taking the rules so seriously even towards the end, because they changed so often. We were just confused. And I think with all this kind of going on, the anger often actually turns into disappointment as well. So that kind of fuels us in acting, especially girls, and becoming braver and stepping up. But also, I think on the downside, perhaps we've kind of had a lack of trust now in the government. Say, for example, the year above me, their A-level grades were decided by algorithms at first, and then there was the U-turn. So I think a lot of us have become much more encouraged to actually step up and think, well, the government doesn't always have the answers. They don't maybe always have the clear direction for us that's best for our own outcome. So we really have to step up. And with everything online, I think with social media, we've kind of spread the messages a lot faster. So not only have we taken action directly, but also indirectly through just even sharing a post. I think that's really helped to raise awareness.
It's fascinating, isn't it, that for your generation, they are already mobilised. We don't need to necessarily see it on the streets, even though we have as well. But there is a mobilisation. It's been happening right under a lot of our noses, even though we haven't been able to actually physically, I mean, from a news perspective, necessarily always be able to go and get it on camera. Just to come back to you, Victoria, and I know we're slightly hopping around here, but there's just so much to talk about and so much that I'm interested in. To go back to some of the issues that Terri raised, Victoria, and that you raised too about never going back. I mean, I suppose it depends in terms of the workplace, is how on board everybody is for making things a better workplace. Do you find at Microsoft that men value flexibility, for example, as much as women now, or is that something that isn't really quite tangible yet?
Well, the quick answer to this question is yes. It is tangible for men equally as for women. It's something that we in Microsoft we have been having this as a standard across the countries. The question there being whether labor law openly allows it, if I can use that term. And the good thing that has come out of the pandemic is many of the countries, at least in the area that I cover, which is 35 countries, we have seen reforms of the labor law to allow hybrid, flexible work style and hybrid work. So that is one. The second is that the company has developed additional consciousness because of this. And not only do we have the paternity leave equally as the maternity leave, we did have programs like the return from leave of absence, which was there even before the pandemic, targeting mainly women returning from maternity. But now we have expanded that to be for everyone, and also for people that, believe it or not, it's for everyone, that a lot of people have been hired during the pandemic. They have not met their teams. So that was one way of helping develop networks and onboarding people. The paid childcare is something that has come back to support both genders. It's not just a female benefit, it's for everyone. And the one thing that maybe we have not touched on it is the price of productivity. We have seen productivity rise, but that comes at the expense of mental health.
Yes.
And the benefits, there have been additional benefits on mental health, there have been additional benefits on well-being days, and also support for fitness, for downtime, and all of that. That is equal to both men and women. And I think given the challenges that we have addressed on the pandemic hitting the women most, I think the primary beneficiaries would be also women, even if the benefits are taken up by men, because so that's how I see it. Now, we have been relatively over pivoting on professional and middle class women. I dare say that there are also opportunities coming out of this for low pay jobs, because there are a number of jobs that can be done remotely, and as we see the transitioning of a number of low paid jobs from hubs to truly being done remotely, and I think that's opportunities for women. Also generating demand for new jobs and reskilling. So many large employers are creating new career paths for even like the best low wage employees. And the third point is for better quality and safety of work environment for those that are on the front line. And technology is enabling that, and Microsoft has been contributing a lot, tremendously on that in the front of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm very keen to get to some of the questions that we've got coming in. I'm going to group a couple of them together, and I'll just put them out there and just give me a wave, panelists. And Terri, I can't actually see you, but I'm conscious I want to keep you in the loop as well. Amna Boheim is asking, what are thoughts on firms like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan wanting all employees back in the office and the impact on women with families? She says that they seem like dinosaurs in this regard, in Amna's view. And also a question from Karen Horowitz, echoing your statement, Victoria, will never go back. It's very powerful and echoes Karen's personal and professional experiences, as well as the sentiments of many people I support in the coaching work I do. A concern is that pressure is being exerted on many people in various professions and roles, both within commerce and government, to go back to previous ways of working, i.e. Regular travel, commuting. How do our panelists suggest this can be pushed back? And can we act as advocates for not going back? It's an issue for women specifically and more broadly. Who'd like to pick up on that? Give me a wave. Kusia.
Well, I've got one.
Victoria.
I think you're going to expect from me, which is, unionize. Unionizing is a really effective way to put these conversations at the table with the employer, and the onus is then on recognition and understanding and health and safety and finance, and we get to have, I think, a real grown-up conversation about why people don't want to go back, what are the alternatives, and what policies and procedures can be put in place. And I think unionizing in the private sector is a big way for that to happen.
Interesting. Victoria, just back to you. And then I'd quite like to come back to Terri on that as well, actually, because this is part of the entitlement question, isn't it? Particularly, Victoria.
Yes, I do think that the conversation is definitely the best way to drive the big changes, the big tickets, where the environment allows. It's a matter of a personal and individual agreement. In the private sector, at least in the companies that I'm in touch with, and Microsoft, the individual is entitled to say, I'm not traveling. We already have the first cases now of having meetings and saying, only if you're willing to travel. Now, the other thing that is interesting is that there has been a recent study showing that, I said that we never go back, we don't go back to the same, but this study that was recently run, it shows that 41% of people would not go back to their employers even. Mm-hmm. Now, that is because the whole situation has given us the opportunity to apply for different jobs. The talent pool is much bigger. We have seen a shift in companies that roles that were fixed to a location, they're not fixed anymore. You can do a global role out of Athens and you do not have to go to the UK, for example. Just giving an example.
Yeah. Thank you. Terri, just a quick thought from you on that, because this is part of the conversation that you're generating with your work with the female lead.
Well, indeed. So this is a matter of setting down your conditions that are useful to you and whether or not you can do that. And I think for the women in our study, when they were able to do that, when they knew that they could show their value, that they knew that their impact was recognized, they were much better than at setting the limits. Julie, I wonder, it was a wonderful panel roundup, and if I could just come before we go into other people's questions, I was so pleased to hear the take on their pandemic experience, because this was very much in keeping with what we were hearing, that, there was time to breathe, there was time to devote to their bigger dreams. And when it came to childcare, yes, it was awful, and the worst thing was the homeschooling. But because there were both partners at home, there's nothing like a child right on the ground to say, I need your attention. And so there tended to be increased gender equality in the home. And if you want, one important route to paid childcare is to make sure there is gender equality in the home, because when it's a men's issue as well, it will be more widely recognized. And, as for pay, the gender pay gap, not only go back to it, but make it more granular so that, is there a difference between women with children or not, women with partners, all that sort of thing, and, extend it to ethnicity as well. Victoria took forward the entitlement gap in a very different way, and I don't want to lose that, because she said, well, now I think I am entitled to say that my thoughts and my feelings and my desires can stand for my decisions. They influence my decisions directly. It's not what do I have to do. Now that's a big, big thing, and maybe a different discussion, but how in our personal lives, sometimes we say, no, my needs don't count as much, or I don't have a right to feel this. So, that's another way we could run with that concept.
That's fascinating, isn't it? It's how it shifted those relationships just within the four walls of the home, before you've even got out of the door or not to go to work. It's really interesting. Thank you for that, Terri. I'm just going to put two other questions a little bit together now from Penny Hubbard. Hi, Penny, and Jill Lang. Penny is asking, I'd love to hear the panelists' advice to women who want to continue to work remotely, but whose manager is keen to be in the office. How does she maintain that intuitive knowledge and part of being the in crowd that Terri mentioned? And then Jill Lang, hi Jill, asks, there's some research that those who are present in the office are more likely to be promoted than those working remotely. Is there a risk that this will impact negatively on women as we come out of the pandemic, as women may be more inclined than men to take advantage of flexible working and spend more time at home? And if so, what do we do about it? I mean, I suppose both of these are part of the conversation around the new workplace, but I mean, it is one of those things that you miss out on in a workplace if you are working remotely. It's just that getting to know how a place ticks, getting to know about the office culture, who to trust, who not to trust, who's a pain, who knows how to work the photocopier, all of that. I mean, I might actually just very quickly touch in with Jolie on that, because for your generation, you know, you've been deprived of work experience opportunities. And I know the younger women that I mentor have really lost out on being in the mix of the workplace. Is that something you're worried about?
Yeah, I think a lot of people in my generation, girls in particular, feel that they might have lacked the confidence because we've been confined to our rooms throughout lockdown. That's also kind of given us this mindset where we've also been confined in our perhaps unconscious biases or internal barriers that we set ourselves. And I think not having that interaction that we would have had in a normal situation has made us a lot shyer to embrace our passions, and therefore that's why I wanted Pioneer to really nurture the passions that they might have suppressed because they think that they're not capable enough. And I think therefore in the workplace also we need more guidance, we need this mentorship, and not only to have role models, for example, that are relatable to you, that you see perhaps have the same background as you or maybe look like you even, and you think that could be me, but to have that role model then to be able to contact you and to guide you step by step, because in my opinion, at least, I think human experiences are the best teacher. You can't Google them. So I think having someone there to guide you each step of the way will be essential, but also not only having that guidance and discipline, but also some flexibility.
Yeah, and perhaps Maria and Victoria to touch in with what, or I could see if you've got something to say on this as well, but it's how women navigate this to make sure that they're not sort of slightly losing out whilst they're effectively their backs turned and the guys might be in the office and the women are working at home. What are your impressions of that, and what's your take on it? Who'd like to take that one up?
I've got some personal reflections, just because I joined the TUC during the pandemic, so I don't know anybody other than the tiny Zoom box that they inhabit. I have no experience of anybody. And I have really missed out on the human interaction, especially as what I think is my skill set and my preferred way of working is building relationships and having conversations, and also just tuning myself into the temperature. And it's incredibly difficult to do. But what I think it has shown is all those things have to become explicit. You have to be really effective at communicating. And also, we have to stop romanticizing office working. You know, it was really nice, and it was inclusive, and it was positive if you were part of the nice, inclusive, positive part. But there are whole groups of people that wasn't the case for. And I think it's an exercise in us building a better office culture that we can then translate to online and flexible working, so people feel excluded. So those people that are working remotely aren't, you know, suffering from not being part of the water cooler conversation, aren't missing out on the, oh, can I just ask you one thing conversations, and everything is just far more deliberate.
Interesting. Victoria, what's your take on that question? How do women make sure that they don't get a penalty for the flexibility question?
Yeah, I think it's not just about women, Julie. I think it's as we shift into hybrid, it's also having the right framework and instrumentation to support it. So I have been working hybrid or remotely, if we want to call it like that, for the past 12 years. And you definitely need to meet with people. And also we need to have a charter on how we work as a team, you know, if it's a close, immediate team with one manager, and how we work what is the etiquette, as I like to say, of working across an organization. So being flexible or working remotely doesn't mean that I do absolutely everything, anything that I want at the time that I want. So putting the boundaries, having a charter, as I said, and also making sure that we do have some social time digitally as well. What the conversation of the corridor has been replaced by, hey, how are you? You know, typing on the instant messenger. Or can I ask you something quick? During the pandemic, we had more phone calls and face-to-face connections than we had even before with a flexible setup. And as I said, morning coffee calls. The discussion with about the newcomers, the new generation that does not have this this type of communication, it also is up to them to be also showing up their face and being proactive in engaging with a new organization. But we definitely need to have the instrumentation there, the charter on how we work, and the motivation from people to connect.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to take a couple of questions around the area of mental health. Jane Morris and Carol Black, previous principal of Newnham, lovely to see you both online. Jane Morris, who's a psychiatrist, she's currently seeing women in the antenatal clinic, often weeping at the thought of how motherhood will impact their careers, despairing of being able to individually persuade partners to share responsibilities, and feeling unentitled when their own income is lower than their partner's. But she sees a dominating concern about body image. They seem to waste so much energy curating their physical appearance, and I suspect Zoom calls have got a lot to do with this, and see it as their key to their personal power. Hearing so much about online sexualized culture and body image concerns in the very young, do we need to address this too to support mid-career progress? I think that's a really fascinating question. And also Carol has asked, you know, there's evidence that women's mental health has deteriorated more in the pandemic than men. Could the panel reflect on this? I mean, who'd like to pick up on that? I mean, Terri, I'd quite like to come, just a quick observation, from, you know, particularly with Jane's question there, about this midlife moment where women are evaluating themselves from literally every angle. I mean, it's amazing that they don't get frozen to the spot, and some probably do. How do women crack out of that, and what can we do to help each other?
Okay, well, the greatest impact on women's mental health during the pandemic, the greatest downside can be seen in younger women. So women before they get to this mid-stage career in their early 20s. And and also a huge increase in eating disorders and also in facial tics for some reason. So it's been very, very stressful. And we're still working that out. Now, to go to your question about how at midlife, when you know, you're suddenly facing, I am not the kind of person, I am not that ideal, I cannot be that ideal, you know, that I've seen all my life. I think there's also a countervailing strength of midlife women where they become more engaged, they believe more in their own voices. Those shadow voices sort of tend to dissipate. And, you know, it can be a relief, it can be a reprieve not to be in the running for that ideal body and that ideal face and figure. You know, you're stepping out of that. So that's how women do it positively. In terms of mental health, it was extremely important for the women in our study to have support mental health lines. Some firms offered mental health lines, and they found that very, very useful. We don't really know yet what the what the causes are and how this is going to pan out. But you know, we've got to be looking at that, because certainly for younger women, it's a big issue.
Okay, I think we've temporarily lost Julie's internet connection. So I will carry on speaking. If events admin could turn my video on, that would be lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much. Does anybody else want to come in with an answer to that one? Yes, Kutsia.
I find this interesting, absolutely fascinating. We did a survey earlier this year with an Instagram influencer, and we had 50,000 respondents within a few hours of mums. And the words that kept coming through and through, and it was about the experience of working mums during the pandemic and young working mums, and the experience, and the words were exhaustion, nervousness, fear, negativity, and just this, I think it was the impact of everything that had, you know, been around and around up to that point. And I think it's really important for us to recognize the impact that women have had, and that's not to say men haven't, but women particularly, given all the other factors that are stacked against women as well. And also what we know about long COVID is going to be significant. We know that long COVID impacts women up to the age of 50 more than it does any other particular age group, and the symptoms of long COVID are very similar to the symptoms of the menopause. And you know, we're going to have to really understand what the long-term impact that is going to be on women at work and women more broadly, and how we manage that to make sure that these women aren't then pushed out of the system, as we see happens to a lot of people when they hit the menopause. So I think they're considerations for us, and they're considerations for employers as well.
Thank you. There's a question that's linked to that, I think, from Leonie Mellinger, which Leonie says, women still hold the mental / emotional burden of the household, even if others share the physical work. For example, research suggests mothers are first responders to children's distress. Yeah. How can we truly change the paradigm as long as this situation continues? It's a difficult one to answer without, again, making it look as though it's us women who've got to make the changes. But I think, I don't have children myself, but I've observed this with friends, you know, and also who holds the mental space of who remembers the birthdays and that sort of thing. Does anybody have any thoughts on how we shift that paradigm?
Well, if no one else, because one of the things that we, the women in our study talked about was the mental load, and that this was more taxing actually than the practical matters. I mean, given who they are, that they usually had partners who were good enough, you know, at contributing to the actual tasks, but monitoring and appraising and anticipating what had to be done and what would happen if plan A didn't work, you know, who had to be where, when, who needed the yellow t-shirt for sports day, who needed this note, who had the medical appointment, that was the real drain. Their productivity would rise. As for changing that, big ask. That this goes back to, you know, very early experiences, very early expectations. And again, what are women entitled to ask of the other people in their lives? Are they, you know, do they owe other people their emotional labor and their thoughtfulness? And, you know, one reason I suggested that firms show that they expect everyone to have a wide range of responsibilities is that they can play some role in normalizing men's participation in caring labor as well. That isn't enough. It you know, has to be done throughout their lives. There might have been a little bit of a shift in recent decades, but as we can see, it's not enough. And it's a big, big question. And you know, maybe because it's such a big question, I didn't make it central, but we shouldn't forget it just because it's such a big question.
Thank you. I'm glad Julie's been able to rejoin us.
Yeah. Sorry about the internet went down and then the dog walked in, and I'm not sure whether the two were related, but at least you were spared the second sight. I was just catching the end of that, Terri. Absolutely fascinating, and it sounds as though that, you know, the conversation continued very happily unhindered with my short disappearance, so apologies for that. But I'm also very conscious that the clock is ticking down on us. And I'd really like to just go to each of you, each of our lovely panelists, and perhaps a concluding quick thought from Terri, on a sort of galvanizing message for all of the women who've joined us online today, for a note of optimism for what women can do for each other as we come out of lockdown to make things better. So just something to send us on our way with a galvanizing, uplifting thought. Could see a quick one from you.
My galvanizing quick thought would be to reach out and network. You know, it's been hard. People have been lacking human and emotional connection, and to make those networks, trade unions have those networks, keep people in, and also not to fall into the trap of toxic positivity. It's fine not to be okay, and it's fine to not be okay, and to share that and for that to be heard. So I really do think it's connect with people and just meet them where they are.
Great, thank you so much. Maria.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a historian, and I suppose I don't, although I understand the psychological approaches, and obviously they're very, very important, I do see things quite historically. And I suppose my view is that we could be at quite a historically important moment. And that what we could see, if we're lucky, in my view, is a radical rethink of 40 years of not very helpful economic and political projects that haven't helped women. I'm not a mother, as I've said. I've heard all of you discuss the problems. I see motherhood as a historical phenomenon, not as a natural phenomenon. I see motherhood as something that got reinvented in the 1970s. And I think that's why a lot of women feel that they're tearing their hair out, because they're expected to be fantastic mothers and fantastically beautiful and have amazing degrees and get to the top. And, you know, this is all bullshit in my view. So I suppose I think that this could be an opportunity to see a genuine reset in the West, but also in the global South, although it's going to be harder there. I think the fact that the Americans are shifting, they're not answering this disaster with austerity, is the most important development, and that is the main takeaway I would have. I mean, that we absolutely need a sea change in the way we organise work and life and our values.
Lovely, Maria. Thank you so much for that. Jolie, quick inspiration from somebody who's going to take us through this next period of this country's history. Safely in your hands, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably say don't wait for a solution, but to try and create one yourself. So if you see a problem, create the change that you want to see, because I always think that someone has to do it someday. Then why can't that someone be you? So again, just using what you have around you. So I had a LinkedIn profile and a laptop. So I just set up a website, started reaching out. And even if it just impacts one person, I think it's worth it. You know, the worst you can get from reaching out is just a no, or they don't reply to you. So I think it's always worth just trying to do that, and also finding your passion as well, because if you're not passionate about your project, then I don't think you can convince other people to help you along with that.
Fantastic. It's been such a joy to listen to you, Jolie. Thank you for that. And Victoria in Athens, I've just got this great image in my head of what you're going to wander out to afterwards. Give us some words of inspiration.
Raining outside, Jolie. So not very so, really, it's our entitlement to flexibility. You know, I believe in the magic that people can create when given the opportunity. And everything then is possible. It starts from self-awareness, as we discussed, and confidence in bringing our authentic self in everything that we do. It starts from us. It starts from you.
Thank you very much indeed. And Terri, perhaps a closing thought from you. You've set us on our way with your incredible research with the female lead.
Well, my galvanizing thought isn't actually optimistic, it's cautious, because I think there is a risk that we could go back or we could go backwards. So I think it has to be monitored. We have to know what we want. We have to know that it wasn't good enough before. We want to be very clear about what the problems are. I think knowing what the problems are, very important. And all too often you see lots of little problems and you put them into a big pot. And I find if you identify them, you can see how to address them. So, let's be specific, let's be clear, and then let's measure our progress, because that's very important, measuring progress and then reflecting why it isn't going as you had hoped, so you can correct it.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much indeed. And Terri, thank you for that incredible talk earlier, and the work that you've done to kick us all off today was a perfect basis for our discussion. So thank you. And thank you from all of us to the panelists who've given up their time on a sunny June afternoon to be sat in front of the computer and talk us through this subject from your perspectives. Thank you very much indeed for that. Thanks to, this is the bit where you should just be able to roll the credits, yeah, but anyway, I'm going to do lots of thank yous. Thank you to the Newnham Associates, especially co-presidents Anna Boheim and Claire Curtis for working with us again, to Beth Walters and Charlotte Price, who've been running this event today. Thanks to Leonie Mellinger of Women of the Year, and especially to our wonderful Women of the Year alumni organizer, Mary Krause. Thank you to you for getting everybody on board. I know we're going to share a link to the recording for this, so you could perhaps return to it or watch it with somebody else and think about some of the things that we've discussed. But I'm going to hand you back now to Alison, who's so warmly welcomed us into this virtual space, and we're longing to be with you again in Newnham. Alison, thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I'm always in awe of watching your facilitation skills, but I think the wonderful panel members today made it so easy because they had so many and various things to say, and in a sense they've already done my job for me, and that they've all given the final word. But I think what really resonated with me right at the beginning was Terri Apter's phrase, which I think was borrowed from someone whose name I missed, composing a life. And I think so much of what everybody said, what Jolie said about, and Kutsia about needing to do that with other people, and that wonderful phrase Jolie used about sharing human experiences rather than just Googling. And that sense we've got of perhaps a chance to compose not just our individual lives, but our corporate lives, the lives of people in much more disadvantaged situations. So I find that such a positive phrase, with also a sense of the need for more rhythm and more rest, rather than just sort of someone else writing the tune for you and you frantically trying to keep up. So thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful phrase, but so many other great phrases, which I know and I can see from the chat too, that have really stuck with people, and that, again, just as our students have found they can re-listen to lectures and they learn something new, we will hear something new whenever we listen to this. So thank you all very much. Thank you to our listeners, and have a good afternoon, everybody.